there are believers who earnestly desire to please God in all they do, but find themselves engaged in a lot of activity that isn't traditionally labeled as sacred. So how do they deal with that tension? Hello and welcome to Calvary Conversations, a ministry of Calvary University. I'm Tim Hange, English chair at Calvary University, and I have with me today our co-hosts, Josh.
Dr. Joshua Paxton, director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement.
And Mike Dodds, director of CU Press.
Sean LePage, chairman of the Ministry Studies Department.
I have a topic for us today to discuss, and that is the dividing line between secular and sacred and how it relates to how we may compartmentalize our lives as Christians. This is a really complex topic. We actually spent a lot of time in pre-discussion here, sort of trying to identify the issues. And I feel like we all know that there are issues, but sometimes they're hard to articulate. So let me sort of begin this process by, introducing this idea. It's easy for us as Christians, and I'm including myself in this, to sort of catch the idea that certain things in life are secular and certain things in life are sacred. And if we're going to define those terms, we would say that something that is secular is set apart for God. It's holy. It's pertaining to God. It's within the domain of religion or faith. And that there are certain things that are secular that simply are not connected to faith in any way, are not connected to any kind of religious belief in any way. And the first question that I would like to ask you, gentlemen, is, do you see this compartmentalization between secular and sacred to be a problem in the Christian life? And what maybe is a domain of the Christian life where you see this being a problem or a challenge?
I'll weigh in, because I think, it is a problem for a lot of Christians, and I think probably a lot of other Christians understand that all things are potentially a means for the glory of God. So say, I always think of Brother Lawrence, who lived in the Middle Ages, I think, and he was a monk, and he wrote a book called Practicing the Presence of God. And I'm not necessarily endorsing every idea in that book, but he, the thing I remember is that he washed dishes. That was his role, at least for a time in that monastery. And he did that as he practiced the presence of God. He was aware of God's presence, and he prayed as he washed dishes. And so washing dishes became this act of service and an act of glorifying God. And so, there are many things that are just very neutral. Obviously, there are things that are wrong and morally sinful that could not be used to glorify God. But there are many things that just don't seem to have any sacredness to them that can be a means for glorifying God. But I think the problem is that many Christians will make that distinction, and so they'll go to work with a completely secular mindset, that it doesn't matter. They, whatever they have to do to put food on the table, and however they have to treat people and whatever. But then, they'll go to church on Sunday and worship God and put something in the offering plate, and somehow they justify that in their minds. And that's how I understand that the problem with thinking in those terms, those clear kind of disconnected ideas of sacred and secular.
It's interesting that you started with the realm of work, and I think that's really interesting, because at Calvary we talk about our mission is to prepare students to live and serve in the church and the world according to a biblical worldview. And it's interesting because I'm not saying that that's a bad mission statement, but even by stating that mission statement, you could almost misconstrue that to think that that somehow church work is different from world work. And there is a degree to which, now I'm saying this as somebody who worked in information technology software engineering primarily for over 15 years of my life. And I have to admit that there were times when I was tempted to think, what I'm doing here really isn't, doesn't make a difference, like being a pastor, being a missionary, or something like that, right? So there was a temptation to compartmentalize and say, well, look, this is just the work world. It plays by this kind of rules, and I'm in it, and really, am I having an impact on the people around me, and et cetera. It's just work. That's what I do here at work. And then my ministry life is, the stuff that I'm doing on the evenings with the youth group, or on the weekends, in my church worship band, et cetera. Right. And even though I knew in my head that wasn't true, that there was a path to making my work sacred, there was still this pull and this tendency to think that. Have you guys ever experienced that, or dealt with people who've experienced that? And I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that.
Tim, I don't know if I'm going to be addressing that directly necessarily, but I'm finding the entire categorization to be completely unhelpful. Simply because it strikes me as a very artificial way to approach life, and even how we define things as sacred or secular. So when I say something is secular, do I mean it's bad, or is there another category under secular which is sinful? And is secular the neutral category, or is there a neutral category that's between secular and sacred? And it gets really confusing to me. And I just find the dichotomy really unhelpful. And I wonder if a part of the problem isn't because we assign significant meaning to a particular activity or a particular place, rather than what we bring into that environment, which is going to get back to, I'm going to circle back around to what you were saying, which is so for a time, I worked as a server, at a place here in Raymore, and it doesn't fit the typical definition of sacred, in that, I'm not worshiping, I'm not speaking, I'm not delivering a sermon, all right, I'm waiting tables. But the attitude that I bring into that, how I serve those tables, how I greet people, the manner in which I present myself, how I present myself to my coworkers, all right, it's the way in which I approach it that has the potential to make it sacred, not because of the activity that it is, but because of what I bring into it, the light and the witness and the testimony that I bring to that environment. And that's true of any work environment. So I wonder if the conversation around sacred versus secular, if it's even a helpful way of dividing things.
Yeah, I thought that was good, Josh, that really, unless we're talking about something sinful, like if your job is to be a hitman for the mafia, come on. I mean, I think we can all be pretty clear that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about something that is inherently sinful, if you call that your job. But if your job is, which is true for most people, they're not going to necessarily see the sacredness in their job. They're going to see it as just kind of a job, and it's just a way to put food on the table. But what's exciting about this is that it's a matter of what we bring. We are God's ambassadors. We can bring a sacred attitude and a sacred perspective into anything. I think of when Paul told slaves in I believe it's 2 Corinthians, where he says, he's talking there about the principle of continuing, and say a wife who's married to an unbeliever somehow, that she should continue unless the husband wants to leave the marriage, because she brings holiness into the relationship. She can bring sacredness into that relationship, and that's true of work. If that's true of a slave who's doing the most menial tasks, then it can be true of us who do all kinds of different things. It's a matter of what we bring to it. And as ambassadors for God, we can bring sacredness into just about any situation.
It's interesting. I was in the Air Force as a chaplain and experienced that, where, as I mentioned in our pre-discussion, at times people treat you a little funny. You're a chaplain? Hey, father. Well, yeah, I'm a father, but not the same kind of father, they would ask. But I was invited to a social function on Friday afternoon. Friday afternoon is usually happy hour down at the club. Friday afternoon at the club, there's a number of beverages flowing, and there was another chaplain that had also been a pilot. So we were both pilots, and they want to get all the pilots around. Pilots, it's a crazy world. It's a high risk world. It's a fast moving world. And so they drink hard and play hard and fly hard type thing. And it was interesting, as the Friday went on, eventually I got uninvited to the party. I was invited because I was a pilot, but I was uninvited because I was a chaplain now. All right. So the world has a secular sacred thought, but there are some things I don't want around. I'm a member of a volunteer organization now, and every once in a while, people come up to me. They now know that I'm a pastor. They identify that more than I'm a professor here now, and they'll say, "Well, Mike, how's the church?" But then you can almost feel the pushback. I don't know how to act around a sacred person. So I don't know what I'm introducing here, but there is in the world, and now I'm sure there's some very secular world. They get out of here. I'd rather not have that. But most people have a tension that they feel in their lives that I wonder if we as Christians need to captivate, but definitely not in a holier than thou attitude. It's an opportunity for us to clarify what real sacredness is. Okay, there's another part of it there.
That was really good, Mike. And so I referenced working as a server at a restaurant here, and that was right when I first started working part-time at Calvary. So funny story, I'm being trained, and the lady who is training me as a server is being somewhat freer with her language usage than I would usually be. And so she's speaking this way and everything. We're about 2 hours into the shift, and then she turns to me and says, "So is this your only job, or you do something else?" I said, "Well, actually, I teach over at Calvary Bible College." And her response is, "And I've been talking like I haven't said anything
like a pagan,
the way that she's been talking." So yeah.
That's let me just add one thing to what Mike said and what Josh was just saying. The reality is that is how the world thinks, but it's truly not a biblical understanding, and so it's really I think it's ultimately an issue of discipleship for believers to help them understand that literally every like the old parable about my heart Christ's home. Every room belongs to Jesus. You invite him into your life, and every room of the house belongs to Jesus. And that's an issue of discipleship. So you're right that's how. And I've been treated that way as well. When all of a sudden they find out, oh, he's a Christian or a pastor. Oh no, my language has been horrible or whatever. Like I've never heard those words before or whatever. But that is how the world thinks. And so we as Christians, as we grow in the biblical worldview, which is really the heart of what we're talking about here, we grow in our understanding of how every area of our lives belongs to God.
Yeah. So Tim, you brought up a topic here. How do we, how do we as Christians, without compartmentalizing our lives, feel that and live out that tension with the people around us, with the context? That's what you're asking.
Yes, and there is tension, and I would suggest that this is not. See, it's easy for us to say, "Hey, there is no secular or sacred dividing line. Everything we do is a unified whole." Look, so I'm an English professor, so is my sitting down to read Neil Gaiman or uh, Brandon Sanderson, his Mistborn trilogy, for example. Is that a sacred thing? The secular thing? What is that? What's happening when I do that? I would argue that what's happening is I'm reading very interesting stories, and that God created us to live within the context of story and to appreciate story. And yeah, these are not Christian writers, but they certainly have a mastery of storytelling, that it's useful and good for me to evaluate that. There are probably some Christians who would say, well, those stories don't have any value because they don't express anything of spiritual truth. And in fact, they may be rooted in worldviews that are opposed to God, and therefore you could be polluting or corrupting your mind. You see, there's a lot of tension in this, right? And I would say, well, certainly not. I have, chosen a realm of story that I think is beneficial, but I would also agree that there are stories I could read that would fall into that category, right? So it's just this person and I are differing on whether something is neutral, that can be that person and I would argue as to whether that thing I'm doing can be pulled into the sacred realm or can be done in a sacred way. And I've had those arguments on many occasions with people. So the lines are not always clear. And I'm curious if you guys would comment about that. For me, the lack of clarity often is in the world of art and the art forms I consume and the art forms I write. And I do see that there is sort of an extreme dividing line. And I've noticed this in some of my students sometimes, where it's like, I hear what's blaring in their car and it's like, yeah, I mean, that's just so below, anything spiritual that, I mean, you can't possibly justify that. It's just lyrics. It's just, hey, but in a youth group setting or whatever, they'll act, there's a very different, it's very clear that with that person, there's not even a thought given to what they consume on the secular side, right? And where there should probably be a dividing line, like they should probably recognize that as a highly, anti-God message or anti the way God designed us to live message. So on the one hand, you have that, but on the other hand, there are believers who earnestly desire to please God in all they do, but find themselves engaged in a lot of activity that isn't traditionally labeled as sacred. So how do they deal with that tension?
I like to think in terms of wisdom. So rather than classifying different activities as either sacred or secular, I like to ask the question, is it wise? Is it beneficial? Like I've always taught my kids to think in terms of sifting and weighing. And that's actually a terminology I got from the Message Bible. So, full disclosure there. But it's the way they translated a proverb, which I can't remember right now. But I liked it, because, so say if you're going to read a book, and I don't even, I'll show my ignorance. I don't know the authors you were referring to, but say, like a high profile Christian discussions around, like, say, Harry Potter, is it so first of all, you sift it, you try to identify what's good about this and what's not good about this, and so you sift out the good, you sift out the bad, and you in other words, you read with wisdom, you read with a biblical mindset of discernment, and then you weigh it. So you're done with the book and you weigh it and you say, well, was the creativity of the author in just writing such a creative story, was that worth my time, or was there something, perhaps, are there other things that would be a better use of my time? And I think about movies, running movies through this process as well. So it's really, for me, a better measurement is not, is this sacred or is this secular, but is it wise, and is it beneficial to me in some way?
Mm.
I really like that.
me-
I was just going to say in much the same way that I said earlier about what you bring to the activity, in much the same way it works the other way too, right? How is that activity affecting you? Whatever that activity may be, how's it molding, how's it shaping you? If it's a book, if it's a game, if it's a movie that you're watching, how is it contributing to your growth and your ability to glorify God, or is it causing you problems? Is it causing you issues in your relationship with God and others? And that's when you need to have the maturity to say, okay, I need to say no to this particular activity from here on out.
Mm-hmm. And I think recognizing that we are to live lives that are set apart can cause us to be honest about and have better clarity on those questions, because very often, and I used to do this too, but I'll hear young people say, well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it? And I'm asking, okay, but what's right with it? Where is the good thing? Where is the thing of value in what you're doing or consuming right now that actually brings you a step closer to God? Are you watching this story and thinking, okay, this story is giving me a window, say, into understanding broken relationships? I'm just giving like one example. So let me switch a little bit to the other side. Do you think there is a tendency on the flip side of this to say, well, the thing I'm doing is a sacred thing, and therefore I'm to be less mindful of how we approach that thing, because we just assume, well, it's a sacred thing because it's an activity or object or whatever that is traditionally considered sacred? Do you think that sometimes labeling something as sacred can be unhelpful to us?
This goes back into why I honestly don't like this categorization system. And I'll give you an example in that I can go to church and I can stand in the auditorium and I can sing worship songs and my mind is somewhere else. Am I the only one who has this problem? Right? Like, okay, here I am who's doing a sacred activity, but my mind has drifted off to thinking about something else, even in the midst of what is this sacred activity. Well, is it still sacred? Is it still a sacred activity at that point if I'm not actually fully engaged in it?
That's why I think it's a matter of what you bring to it, what we bring to it as image bearers of God. I can bring to an activity, not talking about sinful activity that's clearly identified by the scriptures as sinful, but I can bring to an activity a certain level of sacredness, or I can bring a lustful mind or a selfish mind to something that many people would consider sacred. So it's I think it really boils down to what do we bring to that, and with what attitude and with what perspective do we participate in some type of activity. So Tim, your example of reading a secular book, someone else might read that book and say a book that think of the play Les Miserables, so someone might read that and see it as, life is life is futile and meaningless, and it just gets you nowhere. It just gets you nothing but pain and persecution and whatever. But someone else with a mindset that is, I think, biblical and spiritual, can come to that story and see redemption and see love and forgiveness and all kinds of wonderful things in that story. So it's a matter of, in that case, not what does the reader, how does the reader view it? With what lenses do they see that story? So I still say it comes down to how the person, what they bring to the activity that ultimately determines whether it ends up being sacred or secular in the end.
So I'm just wondering about somebody hearing our conversation here and going, aren't there any places that are, or any books that are off limits or inappropriate for a Christian? And now, again, I'm not trying to define those, but I just know that's where a lot of us struggle with this sacred, secular, and maybe that's not even good words. It's more like righteous and unrighteous, wicked and holy. But yet we feel that at work. We feel that with certain people, and how to help us, deal with that tension.
That's a good question, Mike. And definitely one of the things is we need to draw clear lines where Scripture draws clear lines, right? Where Scripture clearly speaks and calls certain activities sinful, then we need to be clear in our avoidance of those particular activities. We were talking before, and someone mentioned the verse in Romans: do you eat the meat sacrificed to idols, or do you not eat the meat sacrificed to idols? And so for one person, that because of their perspective and their history, whatever it may be, this particular activity may be a weakness for them, or it's a struggle. It could be sinful. Whereas for another person, it's something that they can engage in a God-honoring way, because they don't have that struggle, and that's difficult. And we also need to be open to having an awareness of, Paul says this in the same passage, having an awareness of how the activities that we participate in impact other people, right? So how does my participation in this, impact somebody else? Does that tempt them in some way? Does that cause them to stumble in some way? Am I potentially promoting something to them that if they were to be engaged in, it would be a struggle?
As you think about Romans, 14, which deals with these areas that Christians can tend to disagree on. You have Christians who would read J.R.R. Tolkien and say, wow, I see in here all sorts of metaphor about good and evil. And I find this very helpful, this great story of courage in the face of evil, and, everything from the richness of the story to the development of the characters. And they would find a great deal of benefit from that. And yet you have believers who say, no, wait a minute. The Bible specifically prohibits things like, sorcery and magic. And here you are reading this story that's just steeped in this world of fantasy and magic. And isn't this just some kind of weird syncretism between, Christian thought and this sort of forbidden world, and this is where Paul deals with, look, each person engaging in this should be operating on a core of faith. Like, the priority should be not, and whatever is not a faith is sin, right? The priority should be, no, I engage in this because I actually get benefit from this. And that spiritual benefit, that actually helps me in my world of wisdom, in my world of life. It's a very uncomfortable passage for a lot of believers, because it can be interpreted as sort of this relativism, right?
I would say, remember that Romans 14 and part of 15 are really talking about the weaker brother and the stronger brother. And so I think we have to know ourselves. There was a time early on in my faith where I didn't want to read people who didn't share my faith, that I didn't want to hear the criticisms and whatever. I just wanted to read people who were helping me grow in my beliefs. But now I consider it a part of my ministry to understand how the critics of Christianity think and what kinds of things have convinced them that Christianity isn't true. So I feel like I'm stronger now than I was back then. And so it might be that someone is being true to who they are and true to their own conscience, to not read something that other Christians have the freedom to read, and that's, you're right, that Romans 14:15 is difficult for a lot of people, and I think especially for those whom Paul might classify as weaker brothers or weaker sisters, and I think it's liberating to those who are strong, those who are stronger in their faith, and they understand that meat is meat, enjoy it, but you don't want to cause somebody else to stumble, so you want to be wise in how you deal with things that are debatable, and so I think it's really helpful, because strong and weak, that's not really black and white, it's there's a lot of gray in there, and that's really the point of that passage, is that there are some things that are gray, and not everything is gray. There are blacks and whites, but there are things that are gray, and we need to know ourselves. We need to know what it's like. It's like, could I go and witness to somebody in a bar? Yes, because I've never been, alcoholism has never been a problem for me. But my buddy who does struggle with alcoholism, is it wise for him to go into a bar to do evangelism? Probably not, So I like to remember that Paul's talking there about those two broad categories of people, weak and strong, and that to me is helpful in that conversation.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
that's really helpful to remember.
also important there, to remember that, weak and strong doesn't define like, this person is strong in everything and this person is weak in everything.
Good.
Because we all have areas, right? We all have areas where we might be strong in one place and weak in another.
Yeah, and I'm strong in the eating meat part. That I'm strong in that.
Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts on this today. I think it's an area that we need to think. I know I need to be constantly just on guard against unhelpful compartmentalization as a believer, because I think on the one hand, it can cause me to be insensitive to engaging in sinful things if I don't think about the value, what is that value to what I'm doing. On the other hand, it can cause me to take sacred things and turn them into sinful things by thinking, well, I'm okay because I'm doing this sacred thing, but at its core is a root of pride or arrogance or superficiality that doesn't please God. And so I just would encourage our listeners to think about these things and to give us any feedback on this topic. I'd love to hear any questions that emerge out of this conversation. It is Calvary Conversations, so we look forward to getting some feedback from you all. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.